Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us today for our session. The session is entitled Zoning's Impact on Affordable Housing. My name is Marjorie Willow, and I'm a principal with Mullen and Lonergan Associates in Pittsburgh. Joining me today are Hal Coffey, an attorney with Clark Hill in Pittsburgh, and Victor Rodriguez, who is president of A.M. Rodriguez Associates, also in Pittsburgh. And we really wanted to bring to this session some ideas and some avenues that for either providers or for advocates in communities and as well as planners, how new zoning measures could be introduced that could help to alleviate and correct some of the issues, the challenges, housing policies that have for decades forced the way that we are designing our communities. And in many of them, not providing an adequate level of affordable housing to meet the demand for lower income individuals and families. And so today our discussion is going to focus on some of those new zoning measures, all of which have been either used by one of the three of us or have been studied and advocated for in some of our work with other communities. My background in zoning as it relates to affordable housing really started when I was a county planning director in West Virginia. And now I use that experience as I work as a consultant in other communities, both to identify how zoning can create obstacles and restrict fair housing choice in communities, but then also helping to devise new and innovative zoning measures and better housing policies in communities to help them expand their affordable housing inventory. So Hal, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks Marjorie. My name is Hal Coffey. As Marjorie had mentioned, I am a member of Clark Hill PLC, based in Pittsburgh. My practice is all throughout the Commonwealth in all 67 counties, dealing with affordable housing and market rate development, retail, and dealing with all aspects, as we say, from dirt to disposition. So in the affordable housing realm, a lot of my experience that's uniquely positioned, our abilities have been in zoning and land use, tax assessment appeals, and then in the actual development, acquisition, and down the road, disposition of the properties. Victor, why don't you introduce yourself? Because nobody could do an introduction for themselves better than that person.
Thank you, Hal. I'm Victor Rodriguez. I've been working at A.M. Rodriguez Associates. It's a company started 40 years ago by my father, Anthony Rodriguez. I came here in 2004 to Pittsburgh. I used to be in urban planning out in Oregon, in the planning mecca, where the state of Oregon mandates planning certain urban growth boundaries and all that. So I have a fair amount of experience in zoning, which has helped me get through the process here in Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania, where it's a little bit more kind of subjective than objective, I guess you'd say. So I'm glad to be here for this discussion.
Okay. Then want to get started here. I'm going to share my screen. Everyone, there we go. And figured before we really get started into the meat of this kind of a presentation, it's important to remember what is really at the core of affordable housing zoning issues.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor.
Feel free to sing along if you'd like.
Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? won't you be my neighbor?
If that doesn't bring a smile to your face and just warm your heart, I don't know what does. In times like we're in right now, and really any time, it's the perfect remedy to hear Mr. Rogers. And coming from Pittsburgh, there's nothing we're more proud of in this city, dare I even say, than certainly right now Steelers or Pirates or anything like that, but definitely Mr. Rogers. And the concept there is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. And that is wanting to be your neighbor. And in some communities, that's easier than others. But the difficulty we definitely see in affordable housing is sometimes we feel the effect of NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And there are some overt ways that municipalities can use their zoning ordinances and land use restrictions in order to either overtly or covertly keep affordable housing out of certain areas or out of the community as much as possible. I'm going to give a couple of examples here and go into some anecdotes as well. The proliferation of single family districts, I think this has gotten a lot of play in the last couple of years in particular. That zoning can be quite onerous in a lot of areas, especially urban areas, that they want to keep it to just single family homes and what that comes with. We've heard of the redlining that occurred in this country through the federal government back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, even further back, discriminatory policies embedded in zoning. Another is density limits, again, trying to limit the number of occupants or the number of apartment units to a building. Parking requirements is one that we've seen a lot of adaptation from municipalities now, where it used to be 1.5 or 2 parking spaces per unit, depending on how many the size of the units. We've seen a lot more relaxation, but that's still another area of it. Of course, height requirements, that buildings can only be of a certain height. For those either from the Pittsburgh area who were here in the 60s and 70s, I grew up in a community in a neighborhood called Stanton Heights, which is in East Liberty. And in East Liberty, we had the towers, these giant edifices of apartment buildings, and a very weird traffic circle situation in the Penn Circle area. And those buildings were extremely high and almost farcical, like a Tower of Babel. And that really lent itself to certain situations that just didn't work with truly helping in affordable housing. But you could still see those height requirements in communities that are still overly fearful of that kind of approach of a 12, 14-story building that is more about warehousing of people than it is about providing safe, clean, affordable housing. And then another one is significant arcs of time and costs for review and approval process might be quite onerous to provide escrows and third-party deposits and fees that affordable housing just really can't deal with, as opposed to single-family homes that are being built for $1 million per lot and $2 million per home. So that's another way. The covert ways include, this is an anecdote of mine. I have a client who does outpatient and inpatient drug and alcohol rehabilitation. And the inpatient, of course, is in-house housing for the families of somebody who's going through that process. And we were looking in this community, and lo and behold, it did allow for this specific type of housing. But it was only in heavy industrial district, which is just ludicrous. But they were able to make a claim that, now look, we do allow, it is permitted by right in a zone. We've given you that opportunity. You can develop in it. Go ahead and develop there. But it was absurd, because in that community, we're smelting operations and lots of heavy industry that would make it unbearable for somebody to have safe, clean housing and affordable housing. Another is for the allowance for significant community input or opposition in certain municipal meetings. And real quick, I'm not here to just bash municipalities. There are more and more that are adapting and doing a great job at seeing the faults in the past. But part of this is to empower you as an advocate, as a developer, as a person in affordable housing situations, to be able to empower yourself, empower your clients, and empower loved ones. And, so in some communities, they have any kind of public comment to be at the very beginning of a meeting. That may allow for a limitation of discussion from the community, whereas in others, they might allow unlimited time during the presentation or after the presentation by the developer, or even right before it to lay the groundwork for a negative approach and really move the goalposts on a discussion. Another one that I strongly advocate for among those who are participating today is if you see a lack of diversity on appointed zoning boards and planning commissions, volunteer, get on one of these commissions. To have diversity of all sorts onto these different boards will allow for more people in the room where it happens to be able to bring diverse views that may allow for better results and more equitable results. So just using the parking as an example, some of the things we've advocated for and seen again from municipalities are allowing for offsets for bicycles and ride sharing spaces, working with the local transit authority for bus and rapid transit nearby if it's not already available. If you're going to put some density into an area, especially if it's a type like workforce housing, you could certainly advocate for the local, either the municipality or the local transit authority to put in bus shelters or other mechanisms for allowing for transportation for folks. In some cases, depending on, if you're talking about 20% area median income for the residents, a lot of them are not going to have vehicles and are going to strongly rely on public transportation. So that's a great selling point for increasing public transportation in that area. And then also the parking requirements, a reduction in requirements based on tenancy. So we've got some developments for developers that do senior housing and persons with disabilities. We make the argument that folks in these kind of housing are not going to have a one-to-one ratio of person to vehicle. So taking that into consideration when we're seeking any kind of exception from the zoning process. So maybe even to dial it back a little bit, usually I'm going to make a kind of broad assumption. Usually at this conference, we have continuing legal education credits, and that's really a draw for us attorneys to attend a lot of these sessions. Might not have quite as many attorneys without the CLE credits this time. So I wanted to go to a little more bare bones, basic explanation of things. If the zoning code doesn't allow for something that you're seeking, there are mechanisms for looking for exceptions from the zoning ordinance, and just want to go over some of that nomenclature. So rezoning or an amendment to the zoning ordinance. As it says here, it's varying from the actual zoning district classification for a specific parcel or group of parcels or for an entire area within a district. It does require the review and recommendation of a planning commission and then approval of the municipal governing body. And anytime I say we're going to a municipal governing body, I'm talking about like the board of commissioners or supervisors or city council, town council. So when I say that, there is a strongly political element to these kind of approvals, and you need to keep that in mind when you're putting things together. We do have one for a client right now where it's zoned R1 and the surrounding area, almost a U shape all the way around the development, is all R4. R4 allows for apartments up to 4 stories by permitted use. So we're, instead of seeking an exception from R1, which is single family, to allow for an apartment building, which would really be difficult, we're looking for the rezoning route to seek to make it an R4 district. And therefore, a lot of the permissions we're seeking are already embedded within that district. The next kind is a variance. It allows for a less strict application of the zoning ordinance within the entire area, within a zoning district. You go before a zoning hearing board. What's important to distinguish here is if you're looking for a variance, there are 2 types. There's a use variance and a dimensional variance. A dimensional variance has a lower bar that you need to overcome because you're essentially seeking, if there's a 10-foot setback rule that you want to put a building that's only set back 5 feet from the road, that is a little easier variance to get than the higher standard of a use variance, in which you're saying, okay, this is not allowed in this district, but we like you to make an exception for this property or these parcels within this specific district. That's a lot harder hurdle to overcome. The requirements for that include that the hardship of not being able to develop this is not created by you wanting to develop a specific use, and also that nothing else could really be developed under a strict interpretation of the zoning code. A special exception is provided in particular zoning districts with specific criteria under the ordinance. So if you look at the table of uses in a zoning district, they will specifically tell you where there's a special exception. And then the ordinance spells out how you can qualify for that special exception, what kind of additional conditions you might have. Similarly, a conditional use is also prescribed within the zoning ordinance. And again, the highest and easiest is that a use is permitted as of right. These two, special exception and conditional use, allow the municipality to set some conditions for being able to have that use in the specific district in their municipality. So approaches to the zoning approval process, like I said before, part of it is really knowing, really knowing the law, really knowing the ordinance, and having a good grasp of exceptions that have already been done in the community so that you're ready. Like with anything, it's about preparation, preparation, preparation. These are just some other little items that I've used in the past and am using right now that I find to be useful to really sell your development from a zoning and land use perspective. A town hall or public meetings before you start the land use process is a good way, one, to allow people to air out their grievances or their, maybe even not grievances, just concerns that they have, and give you an opportunity to counter them, to dispel any kind of misinformation. It also gives you, it's kind of like when in football, when the quarterback comes to the line, calls out a couple of things, looks up and sees how the defense is configured, and then we'll call an audible at the line because they've seen how the defense is configured, in this case, how the opposition is configured, and you could adapt how you deal with it before the governing body and the other bodies through the land use and zoning process. Because though the zoning hearing board and planning commission are not elected officials, therefore not truly concerned about, there's concern for their community, but they're not worried about the next election. The political body folks at the town council, city council level are very concerned about their constituents' concerns in that perspective. You want to make a concerted effort for a two-pronged approach, working very hard, very respectfully with the professional land use staff. So the borough manager and in a lot of cases, municipalities don't have in-house zoning inspectors or code enforcement officers. They deal with third parties that they bring in. You need to respect the third party's time because they've got a bunch of municipalities they're dealing with. So if they're not overly quickly responsive to you, you just may need to, sugarcoat and work your way in there. Same thing with the political interests. You definitely want to load up on community residents and community support, because just like I said, when you're dealing with the defense on the other side, you want to make sure you got a strong offense and the best folks to the left and to the right and of you when you do your presentation, and also to speak at these at different hearings. It's not a one-to-one approach. For every opponent, you want to have a proponent. You probably want to load up a little more on proponents, and especially people who are active in the community and known in the community. Another good approach, and I'm very proud of working with Victor and his team over the years. One of the main things that they've looked into is acquisition of school district buildings and repurposing them from schools into affordable housing. Victor's organization does just an outstanding job with that. One of my favorites is South Hills High School, and turning that into just an incredible development. And it's just fascinating to walk through there with the extra wide hallways, because that's just how the schools were, and the adaptations using the roof and everything that they did. But one thing to not lose sight of is make clear to the land use and municipal and the political process that if it was a school district building or a government building, like an old post office, again, another thing that Victor has dealt with, it was tax exempt. It was never, causing tax revenue to be created. And now you're putting it on the tax rolls. I know Victor and many of our other clients, pretty much all of our clients, all seek to have, not seek exemptions from property taxes for their developments, because they want to be, active and good members of the community who are going to know that their tenants are going to utilize government services and want to make sure that they pay their fair share. Again, the fair share part of it is always where it muddies the water and where the rubber meets the road on dealing with tax appeals. And also making sure, that the government appreciates that you're relieving them of their burden, both for developing, if you've got vacant properties or old school buildings, like I mentioned here, that you're helping with that. If you're dealing with workforce housing, you're bringing in people and providing for service industry and other folks to be able to do their work and to live in the communities and not have these major commutes. The challenges that you see between senior and multifamily housing, they're a little different, and different approaches you need to come to. I know Victor had mentioned to me before that he's had experience in dealing with PHFA, looking for more multifamily, and that we've really got a glut of senior housing that's out there. I just put a couple of concerns that are specific to each of the sides and going through the process. The good part in seniors is we keep a focus that in bringing senior housing to a community, you're going to be able to keep folks within that community who are longtime residents, longtime constituents of the politicians, and provide them with good sources here. But some of the counters you hear is that, well, with the senior housing, you have elderly folks, and so there's a concern of frequent use of ambulance services, both from a cost, the traffic, and middle of the night in a more densely populated residential setting. We do have to push for a need for reduced parking requirements for senior housing in most cases, in particular for an urban setting, of course. And the need for social services and on-site medical facilities. That's something that a lot of municipalities will push for on a perception of dealing with elderly, 62 and older, housing. On multifamily, absolutely, NIMBY comes into play. Not in my backyard. They hear multifamily, they hear of something that's a HUD development or has a housing assistance payment contract. They hear Section 8, it's poor people coming in. What's going to happen to my property values? That's something we definitely try to work with people on, giving them a good understanding. We've got studies dealing with the actual impact of on property values. And again, especially if you've got a vacant or underutilized property, that this will actually help. And also concern about density of housing is usually restricted in a zoning ordinance. So that's another big one for multifamily. Victor, do you want to talk a little bit about the concerns that you've heard toggling between senior and multifamily?
Yeah, sure. Most of the time it centers around what you just said, Section 8, that has become this key word that people don't want in their community, key two words, because they're afraid it brings too many low-income people to their neighborhood, and it would change the just kind of the fabric and crime situation there. And it's definitely focused on family housing, not senior housing. And that's what makes it tough to get into communities that don't have the proper zoning. Typically, in most communities, the R5 is what allows multifamily housing, but it's usually really hard to find properly zoned R5 districts in a lot of communities. If they're there, they've been used up, or they're just not in good locations, like you mentioned earlier in your slide, like by industrial areas. So, that becomes a constant, conversation and battle with the community if they really don't want affordable housing.
And Victor, I know we talked about it before, that it's a convincing process, and a sales process. You need to sell a community, you need to sell the leaders on it. And this next slide is dealing with some of the methods that you've talked about for dealing with convincing the community. Not so much that we're bringing affordable housing, but that you want affordable housing to come to your community. Yeah,
so like a lot of times we work with vacant and blighted buildings in the neighborhood, and this is a way better situation than leaving it the way it is. And when it comes to senior housing, we've made the argument that at the South Hills High School on Mount Washington in Pittsburgh, we emptied out a lot of homes that are now occupied by young couples and families that are fixing them up. The seniors couldn't do the stairs anymore. So it helps kind of, circulate the housing through the next generation when you build senior housing in a community, and also put that school on the tax rolls, which took away a big blight. And we saw an increase in the home values in the first 5 years of like 300%, because people just started fixing up their homes, and the neighborhood didn't look so bad. The school was a whole city block, so it really had a negative impact on the neighborhood. And the other arguments we're making, is the brownfields. PHFA encourages people to fix up or clean up brownfields when it makes sense. And so that's another thing, through our program, we have the money to do that most of the time. And sometimes if just a straight market rate commercial developer would not want to spend the money on cleaning up a brownfield. So that could put something that's not on the tax rolls back on the tax rolls. The other one is economic growth of the community. When you have people living in quality, affordable housing, which is well maintained and monitored by our financiers, those folks can just have a better standard of living, and they can spend money in the community, rather than living in dilapidated housing. It just really, it's not good for their overall living quality, and the families live in them and dealing with other issues like lead poisoning for families, which I'm on another panel on tomorrow. So it really helps to have, professionally built apartment housing through the programs that we use.
Yeah, and I mentioned before, I keep throwing out there was workforce housing concept. So, the ability to relieve government obligations, and I know that's one of the prongs of the tax exemption, the hospital utilization test, and the Purely Public Charity Act test. But I think it's worthwhile to bring out here too on selling the need for affordable housing in an area. When you have an area that's either getting gentrified or starting to like East Liberty, where it's starting to push out folks who are in that community and yet have heavy retail and restaurant and other, Southside's another one like that. You still need a workforce to be able to maintain those new facilities and to work at those different places. So forgetting about having the workforce being able to be embedded in such a growing community really loses sight of the value to the community. Also in more rural settings, for oil and gas development, they're constantly looking for affordable housing for the workers on the lines and out in the fields. It's another really good selling point. Also for the tech and medical fields, where it's just starting out, young people in these fields, they haven't created their Google or their Facebook yet. They're really at the first steps here, and they need to have that kind of housing in the area. Another is homeless prevention. So, in communities we're still seeing issues there, or for veterans who are having affordability issues, providing that kind of housing makes a lot of sense. And you keep beating the drum on this, but the senior housing, Victor's got developments in the South Side in Pittsburgh. That area has gone through a boom where it's fascinating. You'll see a townhouse that, a booby has lived in for 60 some years, and her, husband passed away 20 years ago. And, she does a great job maintaining it. And it's probably valued at, as is, about $150,000. And the one next door put in the granite countertops and the Sub-Zero kitchen and all the accoutrements, and turned the roof into a roof deck and solar panels and everything. And that place is worth $1 million now. And so when, the booby starts seeing that her property taxes may get a hit on a reassessment, or, wants to be able to still live within the neighborhood, but really can't afford the place that she's in or he's in, then, the opportunities are there for what Rodriguez Associates did with their senior housing and affordable housing on the South Side. People could still live within their South Side communities, still go to their church, still go to their neighborhood grocery stores, still visit their friends, their grandchildren, and it's embedded within the community. So it's really a positive impact of having senior housing. Now, Marjorie had introduced, when we were talking about here, that one of the components we want to try to deal with for the future or for the now is on a better zoning policies and better zoning administration. And one of those that I know I've spoken on before at the Homes Within Reach conference, and I'm sure you've heard banning about, and I think we'll continue to hear, is inclusionary zoning. So for those who don't know about inclusionary zoning, it's meant to be, just like the name implies, it's a countermeasure to exclusionary zoning, the NIMBYism and the keeping you out. So the benefit to the community, it's pretty easy. It's an affordable housing stock and preservation in neighborhoods that we just talked about. The benefits for a for-profit developer, and I'll explain how this all goes about, is in exchange for developing affordable units or providing funds or helping a affordable housing developer in that close-knit area. The for-profit developer can get density bonuses, so they can build a little, or height relief, they can build a little higher than what the code provides, or they can have more units, which also means more revenue, and other accommodations that a municipality may be able to give. The benefit to an affordable housing developer is, the affordable housing developer might get either funds or a co-developer who doesn't normally do affordable housing to work with them to provide equity and to maybe get something that was intended to be a 4-unit or small development and really make it a significant footprint and, like a 50-unit development as a result of something like that. The other is that they, in some cases, they allow for, instead of building the affordable housing for the for-profit developer to get these benefits, they contribute to an affordable housing fund or trust from which affordable housing developers or municipalities or housing authorities can draw such funding. So, there's generally 2 different types of inclusionary zoning that you'll see out there among municipalities. There's discretionary, which is, for lack of a better explanation, this is a really good idea. We think you should strongly consider it. Please do it. So it's a voluntary compliance system. It's used as a starting point or a incubator or test case for a mandatory program. And, there may be less of municipal or community pushback for just trying this out. The mandatory programs are, certainly seeing developer pushback. Philadelphia saw it in their program of seeking to do inclusionary zoning. And what this is you're a for-profit developer and you want to build, high-end condos in a community, and you want to build it at 6 stories, and there's a 4-story limit. A number of parking requirements you want pulled down and everything like that. And so with inclusionary zoning, they could say, okay, of your 50 units, let's say 15% or 10% of them, 5 units, will have to be affordable units to people of 80% area median income or lower. And you need to maintain that for 30, 35 years, similar to a lot of the PHFA programs, the LIHTC and others. The city of Pittsburgh, the pros and cons of it. So the pros are, again, you're building the affordable housing stock by requiring these affordable housing zoning requirements within a community. It also encourages market rate developers to consider affordable housing for future developments. I think a dream scenario is that a for-profit market rate developer has to work with an affordable housing developer, goes through that process, and when they're at the end of that process, either they tell that affordable housing developer, hey, this was not hard at all with you working with us. Let's do some other developments in some other areas or nearby. Or maybe they even decide dipping their toe is not enough, that sorry about the competition if this happens, Victor, but that market rate developer may decide, I think I can do affordable housing and it seems like a good thing. So, the more the merrier in the process. The cons are there's the ordinances that are drafted for dealing with inclusionary zoning have to be really particular to stand up to constitutional challenges, because developers or contractor associations or others may be really against it and will attack it from a constitutional standpoint. So an exaction is similar to kind of a lack of a better explanation, the government extortion of a developer, and saying that you not tying the concerns specifically to the community, not showing that there are affordable housing, there's a paucity of affordable housing in an area, not tying whatever requirements are there to help relieve those issues. You're also could be, if it's not done right, taking benefits from one community, moving to another. Say you have community A that has the ordinance within a city, and they say you have to, this is an up and coming neighborhood in Pittsburgh, would be like your Lawrenceville. And there's some relevance to me saying that too. So Lawrenceville, and everybody wants to build in there. You say, okay, if you want to build in Lawrenceville, well, you've got to provide affordable housing opportunities. But we'll let you do it to like a 5-mile radius, which in the city of Pittsburgh will let you go several communities away. And you might allow for the market rate developer to continue an over concentration of affordable housing in a certain community that is already pretty saturated with affordable housing. The idea here is that, keeping people in these neighborhoods, in these communities, not congregating them all into one area that's the affordable housing area. You want to integrate this in. There's also due process arguments from a constitutional challenge standpoint. And there's an argument that gets pushed around, and I've got a strong counter argument to it, is that putting these kind of barriers to development, you're going to discourage development in the area overall. I always make the counter argument that land is a finite resource. We're not going to build more land. Land exists there. And if you want to build in this area that's extremely up and coming and really hot right now, you've got to play ball. You've got to comply with what we've got here, because you can't just build in another community, pick up a chunk of land and throw that land into this community. That's not a possibility. So you have to remember, as a municipality, sometimes you've got a finite resource. Sure, you don't want to scare people away, but you've also got something that they want that they can't get anywhere else. So Pittsburgh is doing a pilot program within Lawrenceville. And again, if you're not familiar with the area, this was a pretty strongly industrial warehouse area, workforce living, a lot of immigrant community for quite a number of years. Over the last 15, 20 years, it has developed into, I saw a New York Times article calling it like the new Brooklyn. For those from New York, are probably going to laugh at that, but bear with me. So a lot of, the hip restaurants and bars, but also, big in Pittsburgh is the eds and the meds. So the educational and medical development, robotics, the developments right now on autonomous vehicles. A lot of that happening in Pittsburgh is happening in the Lawrenceville area. And so as a result, the city was looking at, had a affordable housing task force that considered inclusionary zoning and was trying to come up with a pilot project. And both Lawrenceville, its CDC, as well as elected leaders, thought it would be a good opportunity with a finite resource of a concentrated area to try this out. So they set it up as an overlay district specific to Lawrenceville. It's applicable to new construction or substantial improvement of buildings with 20 or more residences within a multi-suite residential, or on one or more zoning lots, sharing common elements, or comprising a part of a planned development. So on site, if you're looking to do this kind of development, at least 10% of your units have to be inclusionary. And so this was defined as 30% or less of area median income. And that restriction has to be in place for 35 years in deed restrictions. And the rent cannot exceed 30% of monthly income of those 50% AMI residents. Again, these are standard terms that I think we've heard of in affordable housing, but this was requiring, market rate developers to be able to include it. Well, if they're not able to do this on site within and it also doesn't preclude that developer from getting the type of financing, LIHTC, or home funds, or whatever it is, to be able to fund these components of the development. It's just saying that you need to do this within the development. Of course, they can exceed the 10% if they feel that they've got to do more than that to make it really work. If they're unable to do it on site, then the percentage is 12% of the total units have to be inclusionary in another development, has to be located within a quarter mile of the subject site. Or if they don't help develop it in a co-developer relationship, they have to make a contribution to an affordable housing developer of at least $200,000 per inclusionary unit in another development. This is still something that's kind of just not completely brand new, but is still pretty young in the process. I've seen some developments, I've of course seen pushbacks in exchange for complying with this. Obviously, you have to comply in order to get your permits and the like, but in exchange for complying with this, you get a number of the entitlements we had talked about before, with the ability for more density, for height restrictions to be lessened, and certain other restrictions that the Zoning Hearing Board and Planning Commission will consider as part of the land development plan. The next is, we talked about NIMBYism, but there is a movement of YIMBYism that is going on, not YINSBYism for Pittsburghers, but YIMBYism. And it was this very interesting bill that was introduced in the last Congress. We're in the 117th now, but in the 116th Congress is the Yes in My Backyard bill, HR 4351. To kind of, give away the ending here, it did not pass. It passed the House, it did not pass the Senate. So as a result, when the 116th Congress came to an end, this bill also died on the vine. However, there's a lot of expectation it will be reintroduced in the 117th Congress, and with a very different Congress, results may be quite different. This requires that certain CDBG, Community Development Block Grant programs, recipients are to submit to HUD information regarding their removal of, and these are municipalities, their removal of discriminatory land use policies and implementing inclusive and affordable housing policies. So some of the things we talked about earlier, if municipalities want to get their CDBG funds and be able to use those walking around money, they're going to have to show real and tangible changes to their zoning and land use ordinances and the method for going about it. So a lot of those things we said is covert, overt, and other obstacles to the zoning, including diversity of zoning members and things like that, would have to be included in a checklist. The bill stated it increases transparency and encourages housing policy considerations in existing and future zoning and land use regulations. And in counties are also applicable to this. So it was introduced in September of 19. It passed by a voice vote in March of 2020, but it never got out of the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. Now, it was a bipartisan bill introduced by Representatives Denny Heck of Washington and Republican Representative Trey Hollingsworth of Indiana. And just wanted to note that the only co-sponsor from Pennsylvania was Republican Representative Brian Fitzpatrick from the Collier County area outside of Philadelphia. Representative Fitzpatrick has been an advocate for many different programs dealing with affordable housing. So this really isn't a surprise that he would have been a co-sponsor, but it's certainly good to see. So the one other kind of main thing I wanted to do was plug what was a really good podcast. I know people are always asking around for something that's a good program to listen to, but WESA, the Pittsburgh affiliate, NPR affiliate, has one called Land and Power, and they did this on the Penn Plaza development in East Liberty. And again, we've mentioned here a couple of times that area. It's interesting because as a representative of affordable housing developers as well as market rate developers, I was in it coming from NPR, which is what 90% of my podcasts come from anyway. I did have an expectation of this having a specific slant. I will tell you it doesn't. It does a really fair job of looking at the views from all different angles, from the developer who wanted to build office and retail on this area that was formerly affordable housing, the process of moving people out and giving them other opportunities of affordable housing, the developers' expectations, which didn't match, of course, with the community's expectations, were how the government did intervene in this, how it fostered good relationships, and also while it fostered some bad relationships based on its actions. But I thought it was really, really well done. And I believe they're going to replicate this on others, but I would strongly recommend. There's a link to it here. But if you simply go to the WESA website, you can easily find it. It was a really good program to listen to. So that's kind of the main part of the spiel that I had for today. Victor, did you want to talk about any kind of anecdotes without, calling out certain communities that you've had in dealing with this zoning and land use process? And maybe one that's a good example where you saw a municipality either called you to come in because they saw the need, or when you came in, they were very receptive, and maybe one that's on the other side that you really had to fight with, and how you resolve that.
Well, I've had various examples. Sometimes we have the biggest fights when we actually have by right zoning, which we had in a borough outside of Pittsburgh about 8 years ago on a senior housing project that was zoned R5. And the community thought it was going to change their property values by putting in the senior housing. It was one of the situations where I didn't think there was much we could do other than state the facts. And that project went ahead because the borough manager and the solicitor for the borough knew the law and knew they couldn't deny the type of housing we were doing. I've had some positive experiences where we've had to do some zone amendments. So rather than changing the zoning, which is something you had an example of earlier, is changing zoning is a big process. It goes through the county government and needs different levels of approvals and takes a long time. We did something similar. We did a zoning amendment in another borough recently to allow for senior housing or multifamily housing as a conditional use within a commercial district. We've been seeing that a lot of commercial zone property and small strip malls are losing their tenants because of e-commerce. So we've been looking at putting affordable housing, multifamily housing close to those areas in hopes that it would bring benefits to both. The affordable housing property would have close access to amenities like grocery stores and banks and doctors' offices, and the reverse, it would help bolster up those commercial districts with more people right there spending their money. I think a lot of it has to do with meeting with the community and letting them know, from our perspective, we stay in the community and we manage the property. We're part of the community. We don't just develop a one-off thing and leave and say, see you later. That makes a huge difference to the community, knowing that you have a track record, you're in the community, you're going to stay there. And then, people you work with say good things about you. So, I mean, that goes a really long way in a community. And it's really been the most successful angle we can give them when we come in there to work with them on their zoning and make it work for us.
Okay. I just noticed from the chat, Marjorie, that we do have a question. Actually, are people able to see, are you guys able to see that on my screen that I'm sharing, or?
You can read it out.
Yeah.
So the question is, do the panelists have a sense of how many Pennsylvania municipalities have zoning that would preclude tiny houses, and how many don't have minimum unit sizes? And if so, what are the profiles of the ones that would require variances? Whoops. And which ones don't? So basically the issue is tiny housing, and are there communities that preclude them and others that might allow them, and how would that work in some of the municipalities where you're familiar with?
I know for me, I haven't done development dealing with tiny houses, but I think it's fascinating. There's a couple of communities here in Pittsburgh that have little pockets where they've done them. I would assume, a tiny house is probably not going to need any variances for setbacks, because there's probably going to be a decent amount of land around it, or it's built into a really tiny, like shoehorned into a lot. I would think one of the things that might stand out is if they try to put it onto too small a lot for development, there might be problems in zoning ordinances dealing with that. I haven't seen a community that is specifically trying to keep them out. But I don't really have much experience on dealing with them. Victor, have you heard anything?
I don't have direct experience, but I've seen municipalities specifically put minimum standards on unit size. Like one of them we saw was in a borough close to Pittsburgh. They wanted a one-bedroom unit to be no smaller than 1,000 square feet. That's a very large one-bedroom apartment. And you wonder what that's all about. Sometimes that is about keeping certain housing types out, or they just don't want you to split up houses into apartments when they've had too much of that already.
Sure.
But as far as tiny houses, I know it's a new hot item, but I don't have a lot of experience with that as far as zoning goes.
Marjorie, the next question.
Yes, so this person wants to know about any information on the summary of the House bill that would require entitlement communities, the CDBG communities, to make changes to discriminatory practices in zoning.
Yeah, so I have the panel, the slide up right now. So if you just research HR 4351 from the 116th Congress, you should be able to find it. There are a couple of organizations that provide good summaries. You'll just see from the Google search a couple of good summaries. Another one, I'm sure if you wanted to look for advocacy or anything of it, it would be great to contact the main sponsors. And again, I did mention that Representative Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania is one, but you could also do the co-authors of it. But there are a lot of good summaries if you just do that search. And frankly, there's a whole movement of people for this YIMBYism, that it's not just this bill that they're interested in. They're interested in, in a lot of cases, it goes down to the local level of making sure that states, counties, municipalities have YIMBY-related measures that could pass as well, because waiting for the federal government sometimes is a slog. So, it's best to try to do it from a local level as well.
I also want to ask the two of you a question that we've encountered in communities, and when we make a recommendation in our housing plans for inclusionary zoning, their question is most often, how do you determine what that sweet spot is for a developer, whether it's the right percentage or the right number of units of the total development? And do either one of y'all want to speak to that a bit?
So I think it's always good to look to research and to look at examples that are out there. Frankly, we have an incredible resource here. Jerry Dickinson, who's a professor at Pitt Law School, really has incredible expertise in dealing with inclusionary zoning and a lot of aspects around that. He also ran for Congress in the Democratic primary against Mike Doyle. But he's really got a wealth of information and research on it that I think would be helpful for municipalities and others who are considering it. As far as a sweet spot, that 10% rule, that to me makes it sound like, okay, your margins are set at a point where, if it's 10%, you're really not eating into it. If as the municipality or your community, if it's a county, community development department, or work with the state's community development department and PHFA to work with the developer, offer resources to the developer to get affordable housing funding for that portion of the development. There may be ways of being able to offset so that you're not just simply, tell the developer, we're not looking for you to take a loss on these properties. We're looking for you to think affordable housing. And thinking of affordable housing isn't just about having rent no greater than 30% of the person's income. It's about providing a backstop so that you could develop it in an equitable way that is not detrimental to any of the developer, the community, or the resident. But I think 10% is a good starting point. Being really impactful, I think you go all the way up to 20% or even 25%. But again, you need to balance how hot a market it is, and if it's a red hot market that's already so saturated that everybody wants to get in there, well, make sure you realize as a municipality you've got a lot of the cards, and don't give them away to every developer. So, as I represent developers.
Well, but that's the point that we make is in inclusionary zoning, you're basically harnessing the power of the private market to help expand your affordable housing inventory. And but we also recommend that they identify some developers, builders in their jurisdiction, and have conversations with them to determine what that is it 10%, or if you do 15% because you feel like you need more affordable housing, is that going to stifle the development that you really want to see? So it's good to hear your opinion too.
Yeah, and again, bring them to the table. If you don't have developers in the discussion of putting together inclusionary zoning ordinance, you're not going to have any buy-in. But if you have the value of saying, well, A. Smith developers and, Rodriguez Associates and XYZ were at the table. They were part of this task force. And we wanted to do 25%, but gosh darn it, they got us to 10%. They felt that was fair. And, then you go, oh, okay, well, the goalpost was 25%, then 10% is not so bad. I'm okay with that. Whereas if you say 0 was the, the starting point, and they hear 10%, they think that's my margin. I'm done. What am I going to make out of this deal? Why would I even build that? And again, being a resource, the municipality being a resource, getting PHFA, getting, HUD, getting whoever to help out, not just in doling out cash, but in, providing opportunities there. And then, it's also, we hear it in the Land and Power podcast, the developer just didn't know these things existed, didn't know that there was an affordable housing crunch in Pittsburgh. Take that for what you want, but, they weren't aware. They were in a bubble. You can laugh all you want on that, Victor, because when I first heard it, it did sound disingenuous. And there was a little more explanation to it where you said, okay, you didn't realize it because you didn't think it was part of your responsibility as a developer, because that's not your type of work you do. But you're building in a community, and the community needs affordable housing. It's part of your solution too. It's part of your process too, just by building in that community. So once he took it from that perspective, you could hear how things changed. So
there's another question regarding the Lawrenceville pilot project. Can the panelists discuss how the city of Pittsburgh and the neighborhood are evaluating how and if this is successful?
Oh yeah, they are really paying attention to it. I know the task force had set up, I think, like 5 years or so to. It's a sunsetting provision, and so they want to see how things are. They're going to do an analysis. The hope is that they're going to use it as a shining example, and they can take it to other communities and eventually citywide. But if it's not going to work in this community where land values are skyrocketing and opportunities are less and less, then it wouldn't work in a community like Homewood or others where there's a lot of land and a lot of need, but not as much desire from developers. So if they wanted to do this in a shady side, in a Squirrel Hill or other areas that are a little more built up, that might have to be the next one for an incubation. But yeah, the city is definitely monitoring it. Community groups are monitoring it, really chomping at the bit to see how it works over about a 5-year period.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions. We are at our time limit. Thank you, everyone, for viewing this presentation. Thank you, Hal. Thank you, Victor. Your information was invaluable. And hope you enjoy the rest of the conference sessions, everyone. Goodbye.
Absolutely. Thank you all.